everybody, Oh That Nerd here, aka Terrence. This is the pre-recorded video that is going to play at the start of every Devember video. So what day is it? If you're watching this on the day that I recorded it, probably a day in December. What day? I don't know. I'm not creating 31 of these things. This is to tell you that we are working on the Devember project, which is a remote build system in Sublime Text. Now, down in the description, if I have done my job correctly, there should be a link to the playlist that has all of the videos in this series, which starts with the video that describes what the heck it is we're actually trying to build here. And this video will be a minimum of an hour long. I don't know how long it's going to go because I haven't recorded it yet. It's still November right now while I'm reading this to you out of my brain. That's not actually written down anywhere. I think that's probably easy to tell. I'm not very good at talking off the top of my head into a camera. So what are we going to be doing tonight? Don't know. Hopefully working on something really interesting, though. Probably should have thought that through a little bit more. In any case, we're going to go ahead and say the following. If you like these videos and you want to know when there's going to be more of them, subscribe to the channel, link in the description. If you're interested in videos that aren't live in nature, there's another channel I have that is going to be providing those. I have in the past and I will again. I'm just not right now because I'm doing this every day for December and it's taking up all my free time. Link to that is in the description. Like any videos that you find useful, comment on any videos if you have any questions, and most importantly, have a good time. So let's go ahead and give it to myself in the present, if you will, to continue on faceless because I don't have the sort of setup that allows me to stream my face while I'm working. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Devember Day 12. Now, it is a perhaps exciting day. I wrote a little bit of code prior to the stream and got some stuff working, and now we're going to probably spend a bunch of time not doing a lot of coding. Or maybe we will. I don't know. Let's go ahead and cover what it is that I did in the stream after I committed everything. Last night I whipped off ye old vlog video. And this reminds me, I totally have this symlink in here, which is linked to that specifically because, as I mentioned in the devlog, if you listen to it, in between when I finished recording and when I recorded the devlog, I looked at Stack Overflow and someone had a question, and so I went ahead and followed on their question and answered it, which involved that because they wanted to know what that weird little icon was, and I told them. And as a result of that, the vlog video was a little later than it was supposed to be, and as a result of that, the universe punished me by having YouTube decide that once the upload had only 10 minutes left, that it should just hang there forever. So I had to cancel it and delete it and upload it again. Good times were had by all. But then I went to bed. But then today, stuff happened. And the stuff that happened was this. Now, kinda, to a little degree, bothered me how the notification system we were using last night was working, or rather how it was not working, if the case may be. And so I went ahead and made some tweaks to it. And we're going to look in the Devember source for that. And you notice it says 8 unstaged files, but 6 of those are this enum jiggy here, which is code from this particular repository. And I would imagine that if I was to do something like this, we could wish that I had not removed that. And this is the Python standard library enum module that started in Python 3.4, backported to previous versions because, of course, Sublime uses Python 3.3.6 internally, and it doesn't have enums. Now, did I actually need enums for this? No, I didn't. But I thought, what the heck? Also, I think if I was to look at this, I could have made a dependency on this and then in package control, and then it would have satisfied the local dependency. But I decided I didn't want to do that per se, and I think if I also did this, Sublime Lib, this is a utility library for frequently used functionality in Sublime Text, written by a couple of people in the community. One of the main contributors on the person that wrote the unofficial documentation, and whose name is probably, I can't pronounce it, Fichtefale. I don't know how you pronounce that. I think it's German. And someone else named Tom. I think Tom primarily did a lot of the coding, but a lot of the two of them are working on it together. Sublime Lib, as it says, is a utility library for all kinds of stuff. And if you were to click on that, we could see a fair amount of stuff in here, which tells you how to add it as a dependency on your package, and it gives you various types of action on your project there for doing common things. And I have a vague recollection, although I could be wrong, that there is a vendor library. Oh, I guess it's just pathlib and enum, which is actually pulled directly from the Python thing, I guess. So this is another way to go. And in the full-on package, this might actually be the better way to go, because among other things, instead of having to build up a view line by line using commands like we are here, I don't even remember where we put that. I guess it's in this command. Instead of having to use this to clear, or yeah, see, I do not remember. Was it actually in this file? No. Oh, I guess it was actually just here. I, I overthought what I was doing there. We're building up stuff in that panel by calling append, and the Sublime Lib has a wrapper that allows you to send stuff to a stream as if it was a stream in Python, but it ends up in a panel. So that might be something useful. We're not going to worry about that right now. In any case, I went ahead and threw that in here just because nothing is committed yet, as you can see. And what changes did we make? Now over here in the network code, we include that. Now we have to put the dot because it's a local module. And then I created a notification class that's an enumeration for knowing when a connection was closed, that says gracefully or otherwise. I'll actually have to modify that. If the connection has successfully connected, if the connection failed, and if a message has been received. And as we can see, I also modified so that unregistering doesn't take a key and registering doesn't provide a key. Unregister on a connection just turns the callback off, which you could also do by calling set callback none if you wanted. So maybe we'll take that out later. And it's worth noting that this isn't thread safe when it should be, but for our purposes right now, it doesn't matter. And the raise method, as we can see, used to take no parameters. Now it takes the type of notification to raise. And in particular, it also happens, we don't take callback. We don't turn the callback off. We just assume that once a connection is done, since you can't connect it, you'd throw it away, which gets rid of other issues. And it's calling this because it's happening in close. Now, as we can see, raise now takes a notification argument. If there's a callback, actually taking away the call that just calls it directly, which, as we know, would happen in the network thread, and using Sublime set timeout with a lambda to invoke it so that it's a set timeout with no timeout will queue it for execution as soon as possible in Sublime's main thread, which is a cheap way to make sure that this callback gets thrown off of the network thread and into another thread for something to happen in. Now, realistically, we might actually want to use set timeout async here to make that happen in the asynchronous thread instead of the main thread, because if the main thread takes too long, the UI hangs. But for now, this is going to be good enough. And realistically, going forward, we probably maybe might even want to have our own thread here. And in all the places where we used to call raise, we now call it with an appropriate notification. So if it has connected, you call it gets a connected one. If it's failed, it gets a failed one. And now, because we're dispatching notifications through this system, which has a queue in it because more than one thing can call set timeout. So all of the timeout actions are queued up for execution after a set period of time, which here is none. And things that have the same timeout are executed in the order they arrive. So instead of having to hackily determine if we got a message or not, we can just go ahead and say that every single time. And that's really all we've done there. And over here, the change is now the Lambda takes two arguments. It takes a connection and a notification instead of just a connection as it did there. And the display that we make in the output panel, instead of just saying a callback, has this text on it to precede it so you know exactly what it's doing. And it totally has this 3 here so that we can see what the actual notification is at that one point. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't thread safe, and it should be. And in particular, the part that's not thread safe and should be is setting a callback, because it's not guarded by a mutex. Bad things will happen if one thread decides to unregister at the same point that the network thread has just finished doing something and decides that it wants to raise a notification. Because there's no mutex on that. Maybe the operations in Python are atomic enough that that doesn't cause a problem, or maybe it ends up thinking that it has a callback and doesn't. Who knows? That's the indeterminate sort of thing you do not at all want to have with a threaded thing. But for our purposes, we create the object and add the notification right away. So really the only point where that can go wrong is, at that point where connected is thrown. And in case that ever comes in error, we can easily add a lock in here. So I am going to quit Sublime entirely and restart it. And we're going to do one last test and check this in and then go ahead and do some stuff. So you'll note there is currently no panel, and I'm going to cd into remote build server. And I'm going to .NET run our server so that it's doing something. And you may have noticed when I was diffing that I added, I modified the message to have a number after it and duplicated it a couple of times so we can see definitively, because we're sending messages 1, 2, 3. Are we getting them 3 notifications, and are we getting them in the correct order? And I'm going to go ahead and hit that and say, this is the test message for the notification system. And we see that the panel says it's connecting to Dart. The connection has established. The callback has been triggered with the notification of connected. So if we were caring, we would know that at this point our connection is definitely connected. This stuff here could be smart enough to not put the message until after the connection has happened, for example. And then we get a callback, 3 callbacks for a message, and we received 1, 2, and 3 in order. Now, if I was to pop this and Control C this to stop it, we see that says connection, closing connection, and we get a notification saying our collection is closed and we are now disconnected. And at this point, we would be able to do something in response to that. Now, I am going to clear the build output. And now that it's not running right now, I'm just sort of checking to make sure the console is not throwing any errors. We can see the same actions here. We created a connection. We said we were connecting. We got the connected notifications, the received things, because these are all the messages that went to the panel, and then we closed the connection. So now that that panel is closed, if I do this again, we see connecting to connection failed. We get a callback to say connection failed, and then we get a notification saying that the connection has been closed. So this could be our key to know to pop up an error dialog that says unable to connect to host, or try again, or round robin to another, or something along those lines. So that is what we have done prior to the stream, and I'm starting the 1 hour stream timer now. At this point, I'm going to say that it took me at least as much time to work this out as it took to explain the change that was made. Um, Primarily because I had to look up the well, not the this thing, the one that we looked at first. The this thing. I looked this up and pulled down source and decided what I wanted to do. And actually, what I really grabbed was just those lines. But the thing that I pulled it from also had a license in there, I believe, if I look at the thing. Boom. And a README. Because there's also a test file in here, which we don't care about because it's not in the top level of the package. It's not going to be handled. I pulled this out of a binary wheel from PyPy instead of, and then afterwards I went looking to make sure that I could keep track of the location where that thing was. So the first thing we're going to do is stage all of these lines here. And we need to very temporarily copy that again. But this time we will copy just, whoops, I can't copy just that part. And with all of those files modified, we will say embed a temporary copy of the enum backport lib. This embeds in our project a copy of the most recent as of the time of this commit version of the enum backport library from this. Whoops. Tab doesn't do what you think. Okay. This library is a backport of the enum library that was implemented in Python 3.4, or I guess we might better off say introduced in Python 3.4 for use in Python 3.3 and earlier versions. Now, I embedded this here just to keep this repository succinct and having all of the code that we're working with. As I mentioned, in all likelihood, perhaps we would use a dependency for this. Now, I don't necessarily like to use dependencies in my packages if I can get away with it, and this is a very simple thing. Realistically, I really only, if I cared, just need the one file, which was sort of what Sublime Lib was doing. And that's just because of the way package control currently installs dependencies. It drops them in the package folder. I like my stuff to be just sort of compact and self-contained. Although in this particular case of this package, that's not going to be true because you're going to need an external server. But that's neither here nor there. Now we're going to go ahead and go in here and stage all of our changes here, perhaps. Let's say this was closed, either gracefully or due to an error, let's say, for that one, just because. Because it will get called if there was a read error or a write error or whatever, because it's getting called in the close method, which gets called everywhere. Otherwise, this sequence is either going to be connected, message, message, closed, or it's going to be connection failed, closed. It's going to be one of those two type things. We cleaned up that a little bit. We removed that value and just set none in there. Raising or closing now raises after removing. raising takes an argument where it didn't before, is writable, calls connected after that, and here is not only did we add this, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but we shifted its location so that instead of saying close raise, it says raise close, and that allows us to see connection failed before closed. So you can use closed just to know that the connection is gone, and you can use connection failed to know why the connection was gone, and you could infer that by receiving connection failed and then seeing closed if you so cared. But this order makes more logical sense to me. And then we just trigger a raise a notification every time any message is received. So we're going to go ahead and stage that. And we verified that even after quitting and restarting Sublime, there aren't any weird errors in the console. I mean, there might be because we probably have a nascent threading error, but we're not going to worry about that right now and say implement a quick first pass on notifications. This finishes our initial notification system so that along with letting, a connection owner know that state has changed, they are also now told why the state changed. We can actually bold that up a little. And that's just for the staged files. Now, this uses the backported enum library from Python 3.4, taken from we'll add it in there again just so people know that we're not trying to get away with something, and commit that. Now I'm going to go ahead and open this in the editor because we don't really need that. As a matter of fact, we might even well, I guess we'd have to use a lambda to actually trigger that as in response to the connection. Initting the command could make the connection, and then the test could do something. But for right now, it's enough that that is going to happen. And if we actually ran the server, then we see it receiving hello, so we know that it still works. And as a fun fact, if you save here, we see closing connection because the connection is closed, but we don't get a callback, and we don't get a callback because by the time that part happens, the thing is already gone. So we're going to go over here and stage that. Now this is a very slight change, so we're just going to say modify the test client. So modify the test client to use new notifications. The new notification system, and can tell exactly why it's getting invoked. We may also want to do a little extra thing in here. The thought occurs. I'm going to commit that just real quickly and jump on over to not that one, to this one. We might say if notification is equal to notification. Oh, don't do that to me. Notification.message. Then do that. And I imagine it's going to be unhappy because it needs that particular thing as well. So that still works. Clearly that is still running in there, and we can go ahead and do that again. we might actually say if message is none, log error. Notification says message, queue says no. Otherwise, log that we received a message. Just because it's now more testy and error messagey, because when it tells you there's a message, there should be something. We know we're raising the notification specifically because a message is in the queue. Now, this actually could be some sort of extra system. The queue is thread safe, so you could defer on some calls to message and then just keep calling connection receive in a row over and over again. Maybe we also want to extend connection receive to take a timeout because it's just a call to DQ. But either way, that is probably what we want. And one last thing we're going to do before we get into our design code, which we are definitely going to be doing next, is because that is going to involve us actually turning this into a kind of package. I'm going to leave net test here for the time being. I might rename that. Maybe not, just because until we know everything is good, we might want to go back to using that to test throughput stuff to the server. Now, this is the messages, this is the network code, this is the panel code. This file right here should be known, instead of test client, should be, we'll call it remote build, like so. Just because. And as a result of that file name changing, I'm going to quit and restart Sublime to make sure that everything is in a nice state. And we're going to come over here and we're going to stage the deletion of that. And we're going to stage the untracked file here and notice that the name changed, and then say rename the core file to its final name. This changes the test file so that it has the name that it should have as we move forward with our coding. We don't want it to be called test client forever. Now that it's tested such as it is, it's actually our remote build thing now. Now we need at this point to hop on in. I'm gonna do a little bit of this. What we want to do now is decide the way forward. What do we want to do here? Now, if I was to use my help system for build and pull this, maybe we'll just zoom that for the time being. These are all of the things that can appear in a Sublime build file. And these are the things that are used to actually run the thing, right? Run the build. Now, what can you specify? You can specify command, which is, as we can see here, and as we might know if we're familiar with Sublime, an array of strings. And if you do this, then the first thing is launched directly, like so, and then each of the remaining things are arguments passed to it. Alternatively, you can use shell command, which is a string, and this is executed by passing this whole string directly to the command shell for your platform, whatever that happens to be it bash or command com, or well, whatever the Windows version of command com is. Brain's still stuck in old DOS days, because that's usually what my com spec was set to when I wasn't using 4DOS. Probably cmd.exe or PowerShell or something like that. You would pass this shell, it'll pass this shell command directly to that and tell the shell to execute it. Now, the good thing about that is you get piping and redirection because that's something that the shell can do, at least based on your operating system. But it does mean that because you're not passing your arguments directly like this, you have to double quote them to make sure that the shell knows that this is a file name if it happens to contain spaces. We can specify a working directory, which is the place that is the current directory when the command executes. We can use file regex and line regex in our build to be able to capture the output that's coming out of the system. Now, file regex can match the file name, the line number, the column number, and the error message, and that's used to capture data and show phantoms in line and allow you to click on an error to jump to the appropriate location, all that kind of stuff. On the flip side of that, line regex is for use in cases where the error and the name of the file don't appear on the same line. Where it might say, error in bob.c, and then it might say line 6, column 5, and the error message. Or it might say error in bob.c, line 6, column 15, and then the error message is on another line, somewhat along that lines. In that case, line regex is what's used primarily, and when this regex matches capturing these three things, then there also has to be a file regex defined, and looks backwards through the input until it finds a line that matches file regex, and if it does, it uses the combination of the matches from there and the matches from here. Which provides a fair amount of granularity for being able to do this. Not nearly enough, because if the error message comes prior to the file name, you're screwed. But nevertheless, you can pass an encoding, which is passed to the default build system. It's for display in the output panel when you build, which I haven't done yet. Now you can also provide an env variable, which is an object containing environment variables to use when running the command or the shell command like so. You can use quiet to tell the exec to shut the hell up. So an example of that would be actually in my build system here. You'll notice it doesn't say finished in like you might expect. That's because I have quiet set to true. When quiet is set to true, it doesn't print that finished type sign time thing to let you know that the job is done. And what it also won't do is you might have seen this, or probably if you're used to building things in Sublime, you have seen this. If there's an error during the build because the command can't be found or the command generates an error, not only do you get that output that says error occurred, and then you get to see the entire 5 billion line long path and all of that stuff. Quiet also tells it you don't care about that either. Word wrap, simple enough, that turns off word wrap in the panel. Which I have turned on in my build system as well, because these paths are long and that is kind of short. And you can specify a syntax there as well to apply a syntax to this command. These are all things that we can pass to a standard build. Now, the one thing that's actually not listed here, and I would imagine if I did something like so, there are other options that can be provided in the build, but these don't get passed to the build system. The things we were just looking at back here, these are all arguments that will be passed to whatever is executing the build, which by default is the exec command that's built in. So any of these are passed to the exec command. That also means that if any of these contain any variables like $file or $file path or any of that stuff, Sublime is going to expand those for us into those strings before it invokes our build system. And we'll see more about that in a couple of days when we actually start in the build system proper. On the flip side, the options here are things that can appear in the build file, but they're not communicated to the thing that's actually executing the target. So instead, they're used by Sublime itself to figure out how it's supposed to execute the build. And again, we're probably quite familiar with a lot of these. You use a selector like source.python so that it can figure out what build systems apply to what kinds of files, so that it can automatically detect one, or at least if it can't automatically detect one, it can show you a list of ones that apply and allow you to pick one. Um, you can use file patterns to specify that your build system should be enabled for files of a certain type, like using star.py in this list tells it to use it for Python. If you, for some reason, didn't have that scope in the file. Key files is similar, but if one of these files is present in one of the open folders, that build system is enabled. And the canonical example there is makefile. If there's a makefile somewhere in your build project, then that one can be automatically selected. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the current folder. It just needs to appear somewhere in one of the folders in your project. And variants allows you to create named variants whereby you can add any of the options we saw in either of these two lists. The top level ones take priority, ones inside the variant overwrite ones that are in the outer part, but everything else remains the same and allows you to do things like, for example, in this case, whatever build options are set in the global version of the thing, here in the debug symbols variant, the command has changed, presumably to add this -d. Everything else, the environment, all that stuff is the same as what it was globally, and that allows you to have different variants. And if you've used Python and a lot of other things, then you'll know that when you try to do a build, even if there's only one build system that knows how to build a certain thing based on the selector or the key file, you might see multiple items pop up in that list because there's a more than one variant. Like there's Python, and then there's Python syntax check, which runs a command that tells Python to compile the code but not run it, which you can use to see if your code is broken without doing anything. Cancel is a command name that will tell Sublime how it's supposed to cancel your build, or it can be an object with arguments that will be passed to whatever the build target is to tell that target to build. And again, that's more of an advanced build system thing, which we will see in an upcoming video. And target is the thing that is actually um, the magic-y type thing here. By default, if you don't specify target, it assumes that the target is set to exec, and that's why these options are called the exec options. But you can set target to any command that you want as long as it's a window command, and when you run the build, that command will be executed instead of exec, and all of those build system targets are thrown into it. And then there's of course, a complete example, which um, we might see like so. So here's, a run method that has some extra arguments, and it's actually opening a subprocess to run the program that you gave it and read some data. And it is a window command, and you would use it in a build by saying that the target is my example build, which is the name of the command. So when you build this command, that command gets executed. And also, you can use these keys to specify based on your current local platform what arguments should be passed to the other end of the operation, because perhaps everything is almost the same, but command line arguments are different, like slashes instead of dashes, using exes on the name, actually specifying a path to something if it is not already in the path, like on Windows it might be, here on these it might not be. All of that stuff is stuff that can appear in a build. So what we are going to be doing here is figuring out how we want our build system to work, and what we might put in a build system. So I'm going to say package dev new build system. I guess that doesn't really provide us a whole lot of extra stuff. This one uses shell command instead. I tend to prefer that myself. But, well, I guess I should probably do it again so I can get it to do what I want. Okay. Well, we'll say package dev new build system, because we're not going to care. And we're going to save this into our Devember package as remote build.sublime build. And we might even take that particular argument out. Now imagine um, we can see, whoops, twitchy mouse. Remote build is in the list, and if we were to happen to pick it and try to build something, the exec command gets irritated with you. As a simple test of things, you can say that the target command is echo. And now when you try to build things, the console shows nothing because there's no arguments in this thing, right? If we had a shell command of ls, then when you ran the build, we can see that's what's being passed there. And just as a forward-thinking thing, if there was a expansion here when you run the command, now keep in mind echo is a command, all it does is print its arguments to the console. So we can see, even though this says that the shell command is $file, it's invoking the command with the fully expanded name here. So we're going to leave that for the time being. And what we're also going to want to do is a little bit of this. I think it tries to do something magic. And we're also going to throw that not in packages, but in Devember. And we're going to call it, whoops, not that, I'll tell you that. I'm still getting used to this GTK3 file chooser. Remote build.sublime settings. And we might also say sublime.load settings remote build. Just to get them going. So now every time you save the file, that'll bump. That's a little something you have to do sometimes when you first create a file from scratch in a plugin that's not ignored. And between these two things, we are going to be able to try to set up exactly how we're going to build our, well, if you will, we're going to craft all of the potential build combinations that we could use to figure out how we might want things to work. And that'll inform how we're going to go forward with this process. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is because this is a networked build system, we're going to want to know at the very least, there needs to be a list of build hosts, right? Because this is going to be, you might say, the list of configured hosts that the user can execute builds on. Because we don't want to ask the user, excuse me, we don't want to ask the user to type in usernames or host names and ports. That's a gigantic drag. Now, we might even go so far as to say that the magic of this is going to be a name like test server or something like that. Just something that's human readable for you. And then there might be a host, which might be Dart, say, and there might be a port, and the port would be a number like 50,000. And we might say username so that the other end knows who we are. Probably behooves a system like this to have, I mean, obviously you want more than just a modicum of security. This isn't going to be all that hep while we're doing our Devember code, because the idea is to get a rough draft of things working, and a rough draft of things working involves making something build on another system. It doesn't involve doing penetration testing and hardening of everything to make sure that we're not going to hack ourselves while we're working on our own build system, right? And well, let's say our password is password because we are, our password will be 1234. Is that the most obvious password? And there could be more than one of these. So maybe we might also say that the name is production and the host in that case might be egg, and the port is still going to be 50,000. And here the username is app1 and the password. Now we might also we might say null here, and let's say that tells the system, we'll even comment these just so we know. A standard server has a human readable, oops, I'm going to do that just temporarily. Readable name, where the connection should be made, and who to log in as. Theoretically, we could also have something like a platform tag here. If we wanted to be able to specify what kind of system the remote end is, but let's assume that anything that requires us to know what the remote end of the system is would happen after you made the connection, because you probably don't care about what that part so much until you're actually trying to do something. And if that's the case, the introduction message that we share with the other end, along with having a username and password, when the answer comes back, it could say, "Hello, you are authenticated. I'm a Linux box," or something along those lines. This is similar to the above, but because the password is null, you will, whoops, be prompted to enter the password when the connection occurs. Now, of course, along with, instead of just standard sockets, we would probably want to use some sort of secure socket as well. So that might also be something that would apply here and affect security. Now, let's say for the time being, that's the only information that we care about over here. I'm gonna scoot that down and so that we can see some help and still see an example of a build host like so, in case we care while we're doing the rest of this operation. And then we can see all of these particular options here. Now, I don't see anything in these. These aren't anything that Sublime is going to invoke for us. So, or sorry, these are all things that, except for target, that we're not going to be able to figure out. Everything else, these are things that are handled by Sublime. So instead of, well, we might say, whoops, what did I do? Oh, that's the file that we're working on before, right? Let's go ahead and close that. Or I just figured out a way to create a new file all magic like. This would be something like remote exec, let's say. Now it's not going to do anything when we build. The console says it can't find the target command because it doesn't exist yet. So that's no big whoop. And this would be this. Oh, let's turn the sidebar off so we have more room. This needs to be set to tell Sublime that our build should occur using this command instead of the default exec command. Now this leads to the first design decision, which is that we don't want this to be some sort of creepy drop-in replacement for exec in a way where it just automatically applies, so that anytime you try to build something without doing anything special, that it just goes off and runs it on some external host, because that seems like it would be intrusive. More often, the only way to do that would be something extremely hacky, because although there is a plugin endpoint to know when a command is about to be executed, and you can rewrite that to make a different command be executed instead of the one that would have been, at least for right now, this in the current version of Sublime and every version that I've ever used, as far as I'm aware, the log command, the event happens for the build command, which is what happens when you press Control B and have something like that happen. But it doesn't log that it tried to run exec. It just says running command build. So you would have to do something incredibly hacky, if it's even possible, to try and make your exec just appear in a build without making someone set target in their build system. I'm imagining that you would have to create your own command called exec in your own package, which would get loaded after the default one was loaded, and have some method on it that makes it assume that the very next time it's invoked, it should be a remote exec instead of a local exec. And then you could have an event listener that listens for a build and calls that on the class in the current window, so that when exec runs, it runs a remote exec. It seems fairly hacky and invasive, and it still requires someone somewhere to make the decision that they want to build to be remote. So I don't know that that's necessarily something that anybody cares, that we want to at least care about in this particular version anyway, although clearly I just outlined a way in which it was possible. And we would also say, if you're using a remote command, you also want to do something like this. Now, it doesn't really matter. That's the example that's over here. That's Python. Um, the important thing is this: when there is no target in a build, um, then the default command is exec. And in that case, if you go up here to say tools build system, you see cancel build is grayed out because there's not a build running right now. Although I can click on cancel build and it's totally doing something in the console, which is quite interesting, because as a disabled command, it seems like that should not actually be doing anything, right? The more you find. If you ever wonder why some people seem to know a lot about Sublime and you wonder how the hell did they ever figure that out, the answer is they were probably doing something like this and said, huh, well, that's weird. And you file that away in your head. And then the next time someone asks a question about it, you totally have the information. But in any case, getting back to the topic at hand, that's they're grayed out right now because there's not a build running. If there was a build running, then it wouldn't be, and it would allow you to cancel a build. Um, but if you use a custom target, then it Sublime doesn't necessarily know how it might actually go about canceling a build in that case, because it doesn't know how it's running. So in that case, cancel build would be grayed out anyway. If you provide cancel, you can provide one of two things. You could provide a string, in which case it's a command to run that will cancel the build, like you might say remote exec cancel as a command, which undoes whatever remote exec did to start something. Or you can do it like this, where you provide an object, and in that case, it invokes this target with these arguments to tell it to do something special. So we're going to want that. And we also require the canceled key to ensure that remote builds can be canceled using the standard commands. Now, that's those two things from this particular system. If any of these others appeared, we wouldn't know about it. It's up to you as the person that makes the build system to know what selector is, and that's going to just cause Sublime to call this we don't care. File patterns, same way. Key files, same way. Variants, Same way, that is just telling Sublime that there are more combinations of command arguments that it might need to use. It might need to use a different command on Windows while everything else stays the same. Cancel, we just covered. Target, we just covered. And these are all things that also replace key things based on the current platform. So if everything about a build was exactly identical in every regard for all platforms except for the command you run, then you could do something like this. And maybe you might only need one for Windows and the default, if Linux and Mac OS both had a command named Python available automatically, then you might use that, just here as the default up in the top of the build, and then you only need a Windows key to specify that. That's all things that we don't necessarily care about. I'm going in the wrong direction. No, I'm going in the right direction. Now we're at exec options. So these are the things that will actually allow something to be built. Now we're going to assume that as a remote build, it's important for us. That should be a string. These specify what command should be executed on the remote server when the build happens. These have variables expanded by Sublime. And as such, if we want our own variables, we need to use other options. And we could also do something like remote command is that, and remote shell command is that. Now here, these ones are not blue because they're not standard keys. If these appear, they supersede the versions above and will thus be used instead. These have variables. We are responsible for expanding variables, so it might be easier. I could just do that for the user to use these if they use custom variables. Now, what does that mean? As I mentioned, if you remember in the console when we were using exec or echo as the command, it expanded $file to this. So that means that if these both said $file like so, then in this one, when Sublime passes this argument to the command, $file is expanded to the name of the current file. In this one, remote shell command, if it exists, you get the argument $file. It's not expanded because Sublime doesn't know what this argument is, so it doesn't want to screw with it because that would cause you problems. The other way to do something like this is to do something like that. Oh, sorry. Crunk. That. So if we did this, then as JSON, this says this is a slash, a literal slash, because slash is a character that is special for quoting things, followed by a $sign, followed by this. When this is loaded into Sublime, the JSON part removes that part to look like that. So that would cause this to appear to be, and is this just neither here nor there. That would cause Sublime to see the value like this. And when it sees a quoted $sign like this, it doesn't expand the variable, but it does remove this. So In the end, specifying your custom variable like this with two slashes in front of it is the same as using this one but with the dollar sign, except that this one is theoretically easier to read and less prone to failures. So we're going to say that what we would do is we would try to pull these out of the thing to use, and if they weren't found, then it would use one of those instead. So that's going to be how we provide to the remote end of the system how it's going to actually pull data. So that's good. Now, here's the next thing to think about, working dir. This is going to be what? This is where we really start having to think about things. So let's leave that one alone for a minute and go file regex is something and line regex is something. These kick special action off in the remote end. In particular, these need to be recognized by the server so that it can rewrite messages as it's transmitting them back. And we're going to cover that in just a second. We're going to say result regex threshold. We'll say 4. That's a number that we're going to use in just a second. And the working dir is going to be something we need to think about. That's going to be something we need to think about, which is based on the parts that we're coming up on. Encoding can just appear. So we might put those up here. We might say encoding is something. As in Sublime, this just sets the encoding that the output panel uses to decode output. Very straightforward. You're going to set that, and we're going to assume that similarly the build knows that it needs to output into that encoding to make sure that everything works. The next thing that could be here is env, which is going to be an object. Whoop. This is passed as is to, well, this is passed, I'll say, to the server. Any environment that's set here thus takes effect on the remote end while the task is running. And that's assuming that .NET totally allows you to do something like that, because I'm not entirely sure that it does. And we might also put quiet and word wrap in here. These are just, as in Sublime, we'll just say these are used to track, or used to control what appears in the output panel and how it appears. Enough said. Syntax falls into the same category. I'm assuming that that goes to text, plain text.tm language, if I had to guess. We can totally use this to determine packages text. Oh, whoops. What did I say? Just text? Yeah. They all start in packages. I should know that. And that's all of the items that are there. So we would now go to this. These are variables that can expand. Some of these aren't going to make a hell of a lot of sense, right? We're going to need a special section for that. But here's the thing. Now, this is what I've sort of been putting off until now because it's a somewhat big topic. and that is how exactly is this build going to work? Now, we know we can create a network connection to the other system. How does it actually run the code on the other system? Well, we already know that we have our own custom command, so we can use that to make our network connection and do stuff. We've said that these values, which I'm going to assume I should move. No, we're going to leave those there. These values are special in that they are transmitted to the other end, and the only difference between the two of them is Sublime expands variables here, so only these variables that we see in this panel will expand over there. Whereas over here in these, we're going to have to expand those variables ourselves, so we have the freedom to put any other variable that we want in the system and have it expand there as well. Um, the last thing that we might also want to apply here, now that I'm thinking about it before we get too far, is server windows and I think that would be, whoops, server OS X. Let's say Windows is a thing, OS X is a thing, and Linux is a thing. Okay. We'll go ahead and do that the smart way this time. The guy who did it, not the guy who wrote it. These work like their local counterparts of the same name, except that they are applied to the arguments used for the build based on the platform that the server, reflow that, is running on instead of the client. Now the client ones are all things, we'll move these up here because they sort of apply to the start of those things. If there was a Windows and OS X or a Linux, these arguments would, Sublime would apply these on top of the arguments before it calls the command. If we want to do that for the server, then we have to have our own, and that means whatever arguments are in here, whatever arguments we get in the command, we will have to replace with this before we do anything else. That's fairly straightforward. Okay. That is important. Now, how do we actually execute the build? Now, standard logic, and this actually came up in the Sublime forum the other day. Someone wanted to remotely execute something on his Raspberry Pi, and he was using the remote subl package so that he could be in the terminal on the Raspberry Pi and rsubl up a file and have it open on his local machine for editing things. And then he wanted, when he hit Control B over on this machine, for the file to execute on the other end. And we worked out a simple thing. It was, I think, a Python file using SSH to execute the appropriate command on the server. Now that works for a single file, but we're going to assume that we want to build arbitrary things and not just single files. And that's also not a good solution because you have to know, there has to be some sort of mapping between where the file is on the local machine and where it is on the remote machine. So that is going to be an issue as well for us, and it would have been an issue for that guy as well. The other thing we could do is say that you have to be using some sort of remote mounted file system like Samba or SSHFS or something along those lines. I guess CIFS instead of Samba these days, showing my age there. If that was the case, then you could be editing files on a network share, and when you run the command, it just has to go over to that end and execute the command there. And the files are already present. Maybe that is a way to go. That's not what we're going to do here, and primarily that's because the impetus to build this package is because I want something that does something like this. And in my specific user case, that's not something that would be useful to me because the systems that I want to build on don't have a file system I can mount, and I'm not allowed to set one up. So that is a no-go for me. But that leaves us with a third option, which is to somehow gather all of the files from the local system and shuffle them across the network using our network code to the server, and then run the command on the server and have the server extract the files that we gave it and run the thing over there, and then tell us what happened as a result of doing that build. Now, going forward, we maybe also want the ability to pull files from the remote server back to here, because in the general case, build systems are for, building code and running programs. But if you actually wanted to compile an executable and then bring it back to your own system to pass out or something, you need some way to do that. And how do we specify that? Now, as I said, there are these values over here. We could just say whatever the current file is, send it. That's great if you're editing a single Python file, like the network code. But then we modified the network code to have a messages.py. So now we're screwed because there's two files. What are we going to do? And I've thought about how this might work, and we'll see how far we can get here. Now, I think if I did edit project, we can see my my build system for the remote build server runs .NET Build. I specifically set it to run in the project path remote build server, so no matter where I am in this project, when I build, it builds that thing. Like even here, if I'm looking at this file, assuming that that was actually the build that was set. So I'm going to go ahead and put that back now before I forget. You'll see it. The build system from the project appears in the menu underneath automatic before everything else with the name that it appears over there. And now if I push build over here, I totally get that build running. And there's a couple of variants in there. Now, here are the things. Now, this is a list of all of the folders that appear in the path on the left. And they have three items. One is this, one is that, and one is the third one, which is folder include patterns, which is also something like that. And I'm not going to save this because I'm not entirely sure what it'll do. I bet you everything in that thing goes away if I do it, though. No, huh? Only Python files are included, and those things are excluded. I'm not entirely, I'd have to look up exactly what these things do. I don't think I have a, yeah, I didn't think so. I don't have help for that per se just yet. It's coming. But generally, you provide a path, and then you can say include these files and exclude those files. And because we've told it to include only Python files appear over in the thing over there. It sort of remains to be seen why these files that aren't Python files are appearing. If we turn that off, it loads everything, and we can even see down in here there's this bin, debug. These are all ignored by Git, which is why they're that color. But turning this back off causes it to redact those files out because we don't care. So it's removing things. So I'm saying that we would need in our little build system here, say project folders. Now we might even actually just do it this way. And folders is going to be a list. And inside the list, there can be a path, which is something. And there can be folder include patterns, which is a list of things. And there can be folder exclude patterns, which can be a list of things, let's say. And just to test this again. What if this was like so? Now it's only excluding things and it's not including things. What if I said license? Yeah, see that's some level of weirdness that I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. But nevertheless, that is the idea. So we're gonna say that this is specifies folders that are part of the build. And we'll go ahead and turn the sidebar off temporarily again. All of this thus indicates exactly what files need to be sent to the remote system to perform the build. Now here's the smart thing. This can be a list of one or more paths in the format laid out below. And there's three things that this can be. One, explicitly set in the build file. It's used as seen in the build. Two, not in the build, but used with a project. Use the folders from the project. And this is how I originally envisioned this, but I'm a little weirded out by how setting a folder include pattern for certain things doesn't seem to hide them over there, so I'm not sure if that works the way that I would expect it to, but we'll see. And three, not in the build, not with a project, but folders are open. Use those open, oh, well, that's going to bug me. Use those open folders. Assume that everything is included. Not in the build, not with a project, no folders open. Just send the current file. So here's how this is going to work. This is going to be absolutely required. It specifies where the path we're talking about exists, right? I gotta fix my typo. And if this is included, then only files in the path above that match patterns in this list are included in the build. Any files that don't match the include pattern don't contribute to the build, right? If this is included, then any files that would otherwise be included in the build will not be included in the build if they match entries in this list. This means that if used with the include patterns, that the include applies and then the exclude takes away. Now this may be subject to change as I investigate exactly how these options work in the project, because like I said, I don't think that necessarily worked the way I expected, but one would envision such as this whole option. If you were making a build system for a specific project, such as the remote build we're doing here, then you could specifically say, I know I have a bunch of files open in the sidebar, thus, but the path that we actually care about is a file that is at project path slash remote build server to tell it that only files inside this path are the ones that we care about for this particular build. And then we could say nothing, in which case it'll just find everything under this and use those as part of the build, where using as part of the build means grabbing them and sending them to the server for the server to do something with. You could instead say exclude. Don't exclude the obj folder. Oh, I know why that didn't work. There's file include patterns and folder include patterns. Thank the heavens. Okay. That is why that was not doing what I wanted. We need to expand that over there. If I did file include pattern star.py, then the only files that appear are Python files throughout this whole thing, and folders, but the folders are empty, right? Because there's no Python files in them. If this was just star, then it's all of the files, and then you could say file exclude patterns, and the patterns you would exclude are star.py with a comma, and now everything but the Python files exist, and these ones are just for folders. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do file include patterns. Boy, talk about things that you know inherently and take for granted, and then they just sort of come to you out of the blue. This would also be exclude thus. Okay, so again, I'm just going to go back and toss those out so the project works the way that I expect it to work. So let's go ahead and replay that from the beginning. If we were doing a very specific, very targeted build, such as the one built into this project, like so, or we just were working on something so big that we created a Sublime build file in our user package, which, as we saw when I created this one, is very easy. You say, I added it to the command palette. I don't think it's there by default, but sorry, build system, new build system down there at the bottom. It pops up this thing. You type whatever you want in it. When you try to hit save, it tries to save it in your user package. You're good to go for your custom build. If either one of those things is happening, then you would specify a specific location, either relative to your project, relative to nothing, could just be hanging off the root of your system, whatever. And if you did nothing, it would pull all of the files. You can then also say only include these folders as a part of that, only include these files as a part of that. Exclude from what you might have otherwise included this. So you might just say that folder, but not the bin folder, which or that folder, but not the obj files that are contained in it. Or you could use all of them together. And in that case, first it uses this to see if it should include something. So only things that match this may possibly be included, and then these ones are applied, and if they apply, then they're not included and it gets thrown away. The second thing that you could do is not put it right in your build file, but you're just using a project such as the one that I have here, for example. Imagine that this was the top level and I was working on this build server in its own project, which is probably what will happen once Devember is over and I split all this code apart, depending on how this all goes. In that case, you don't have your build system just has to say that it's using this target and cancel, but you leave out the folders. And then it says, okay, well, you didn't specify one in the build, but there are some sort of options in the project, and we can use the project file over here, the full path to the current project file. It's something that's available to plugins. You don't necessarily need that. To load this file, find the same stuff as would appear here and apply that information instead. That is simple enough, right? Maybe you don't have a project open. Maybe you just have a folder open. Um, and in that case, it could just assume because you didn't put it in the build system and you don't have a project, then just everything in the folder you have open has to go to be a part of the build. Now, behind the scenes, what we're actually doing here is slightly more complicated than that. We're going to have to walk the local directory to find all of the files that um, are interesting to us. And then the very first time a build happens, we'd have to capture the contents of all of those files and ship them to the remote server. And once on the remote server, the command would execute over there, and then the build would be done. And then the next time we do a build, because this is still here and the server is still there and we're still connected, we could just do a simple scan and say, okay, well, now I know this file changed, all the other ones stay the same. So then we just have to transmit the changed files to the server, and we tell the server we're performing a build, here's a patch, and it'll just update the files that we specify. So that'll keep that a little nicer. And we can also expand the system to have the ability for us on the local end to say, I don't care what you think you have, here's a complete pack, throw everything away. We might be able to negotiate with the server and say, hey, can I send a patch? And the server might say, well, here's the information I have. These are the files I have for that project. And, you know, these are the last modification dates of them, and then you could try to do something. These are all things we could do. That's not necessarily what's going to happen in Devember. But this is the main part we want to focus on because I'm guessing launching an external task fairly simple to pull off in C sharp. I mean, fingers crossed. To be honest, I haven't fully verified. Well, I think I verified that .NET Core runs on macOS. I just don't know if it runs on the version of macOS that's available on my laptop because I'm still running 10.10 because it's a like 2012 MacBook and it runs slow enough as it is. It doesn't need to have an extra bloated copy of macOS on it. Um, so that part should be relatively simple. Now I'm envisioning that on the server end, some combination of your your username and password, and maybe your project folders would allow the other end to know about who you are, and it would have its own little cache area where it writes these out. So it would you're sending it information based in folders, and those folders are relative to some location, and then that's replicated on the server in a little cache directory so that the relative paths of all the files are the same, and then the command you give is run on the remote system in that folder. Now that means that the contents of the files can't refer to things by absolute names, only by relative names, but that's not really a problem that we could necessarily help with. Anyway, um, you could perhaps configure where that goes, but that's down the line. We don't want to overcomplicate this thing. And then, the future, those files would still be there. So this is the most important part of that whole thing, which I think I just said. I sort of when I'm in designy mode, I often things flash in my head as things that might be interesting, and I really do my best work with mind mapping, but I don't have a Linux mind mapper. I normally use SimpleMind for that. But in any case, the other thing that we need to worry about is these things here, the file regex and the line regex. Remember, file regex is used to match when there are errors. It can have the file name, the line number, the column number, and the message. And line regex just has the line, column, and message, but no file name. So you either have to use this by itself if the error message appears on one line, or the two of them together, and line regex has to match something that matches the line and the error message and the column, and then it looks backwards through the output until it finds something that matches file regex, and then it uses that line and the line that it found to provide the error information. Now, one of the things the build is going to have to do is transmit the information that the command on the other end is or outputting across the network to us to display in our little, build results type panel over here. And if it's doing that, any error messages that it generates are going to be relative. They're going to mention the paths that are on the server. They're not going to mention the paths the way they exist on this local machine, right? So that is clearly an issue. So what we're going to say is these options, if they apply on the server end, it's going to use these regular expressions to match output. And if things match, whenever it finds a file name that matches, it's going to have to rewrite the message before it sends it across to update the path so that it looks like what the path would have been on this end of the operation. And that's easy if there's a file regex because that has to match everything all in one shot. And if file name is in there, file name is in there, and you can go ahead and squibble the thing around because presumably this thing knows that the cache directory is blah on that end, and on this end, when we transmit the things, we're going to say, here's the contents of directory hoo-ha, and it writes the contents of directory hoo-ha into blah on that end. So that's an easy sort of mapping. At least I think it's going to be easy. Complicated when there's a line regex because now it has to look backwards when line regex matches in order to determine where exactly in the output file regex is, so that it knows that file regex is a line whose file name needs to be twiddled around. There's no file name in line regex, but Sublime only examines this one and then this one. It doesn't do anything with file regex if there's a line regex and the line regex doesn't match. So I'm guessing, and maybe I'm overcomplicating this, we need to do something about that on our end, because otherwise we could get output where Sublime doesn't think there's an error, but we thought there was an error, and we rewrite the output, and then it still doesn't work, and things are weird. And in that case, we're going to say there has to be a threshold of how many lines between line regex and file regex there can be before it decides that it's just not going to happen. Because if these two exist, then we have to buffer the output that the command on the server is generating line by line, so that when we see the line regex, we can go back and say, okay, we found the file regex, rewrite that line. Everything from there up to the line that we just added can be flushed to the other side in one big shot. Foop. But otherwise, let lines that don't match through. And then so we can have a threshold here. Now that's the other way to do that is to just buffer everything and send it at the end. That's terrible. And we really only need to do buffering when line regex is existing. So let's assume that there's a known threshold that the user could set. We'll say maybe there's a default of like 4 lines or something. And then the person that makes the build, who's going to know what their tool does, is going to know, well, that's really only 2 lines. We don't need to buffer that much. So if in the general case a line comes and it doesn't match file regex and it doesn't match line regex, then send it out. As soon as we find something that maybe matches, if there's a line regex, we have to buffer 4 lines and then start letting them go. And in the specific case where we find a file regex, after we found a line regex, we look back and say, now everything from there right to the end can go because those are definitely paired together. I think that's going to give us pretty good throughput. Now, there is actually a little bit more that maybe we need to worry about here that I think will become more apparent as we proceed, such as what is the working dir going to be? Because the working dir would be based on something on the local system, and in that case, do we provide as a part of our transmission to the other end the list of folders and files that it's doing stuff with? If we also passed the working directory and some sort of relativeness between the two of them, some relationship, then the server could work out the working directory on the server based on what the folder on the local end is. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe we have our own versions of a lot of these things. Like instead of platform, there could be remote platform that expands to what the platform is doing on the other end in case you cared. Or maybe file path could have a remote file path that expands to what the path on the remote system is. That seems like something we might want. Similarly, maybe folder, maybe project. We'd have to see how well those map to what we're doing on the other end. There is a limit to how cool something like this can be, I think, at least for the purposes of our Devember project. The goal here, again, as I said way back in the beginning of day one, is this is a fun project, it's a learning project, and it's a proof of concept project. So it's entirely possible by the time Devember ends, we just throw this entire thing away. We don't care. We've learned how to do networking, and then we discovered that our idea of how to transmit files to the other end is complete and utter crap. Um, Perhaps we'll have to see how it all works out. Um, Certainly, folders would be considered maybe the same as the items in here. So that's stuff we're gonna worry about later. For now, it has been 1 hour and 20 minutes since I started timing, which is actually a little bit longer. It's been an hour and a half of stream, so it is time to call the stream to an end. I'm going to check in these two sample files here as they're sort of guiding us towards what we're trying to do something with. We didn't really get to it, but part of the build system is going to be deciding what host to connect to. So there might actually be something in here. We could just add it really quickly. Remote host. And the name of the the name of the host to build with, or null to prompt. And this requires you to set whoops. This requires you to set up these settings first, and then in your build, you could say remote host test server, and it automatically infers all of that information. Or if you say null, the first time you build, it's going to pop up a chooser that says, hey, there's a test server and there's a production server, which one you want to use. And it might even show you the credentials in there, except for your password, obviously. And then you pick one, it connects there, and it uses another command, allows you to say, forget that one, use this other connection instead. That's neither here nor there. But that's the crux of what we're going to be working on for the foreseeable next couple of days, I think, is code for dealing with this. All of the possible permutations. Does the build contain a folders? Then we need to specify that. Does it come from a project? Then get them from there. If there's no project, query the window and pull them from there. If not, come up with just whatever the current file name is and call that good. And we're going to have to do that and try to determine how exactly we're going to go about coming up with that list of files, how we're going to store it locally, and then presumably it's fairly simplistic in the general case to create messages that we can use to transmit those to the other end, although that does require us to do more protocol stuff. But that is going to be the end of this stream. Thank you so much for watching and following along on the Devember project. Don't remember, if you love this stuff, you can subscribe to this channel or my alternate channel. Links to both of those in the description area below. And once Devember is over, we're going to be going back to regular weekly live streams and also just doing regular videos. So if you have any questions about this stuff that you'd like covered in one of those videos, or ideas for topics you'd like to have covered in one of those videos, then please do drop a comment in the comment section on any one of these streams or devlogs, or hit me on Twitter at OdatNerd. But until that until tomorrow night at roughly 23 and a half hours or 22 and a half hours from now, as I'm saying this, when we start the dev stream for the 13th. Lucky Thursday the 13th. This is me saluting when you can't see it, reminding you to stay sublime.